To see all of you. Thank you for coming this morning. I'm Scott Hoezee. I'm the director of the Center for Excellence in Preaching at Calvin Theological Seminary here on campus, and we are a sister partner institute with the Worship Institute that John Whitfleet and Kathy Smith and Kristen Verhulst lead. And this is, as John said yesterday, after the opening worship service, first time in 3 years that we have been able to hold this event. In fact, by Facebook, you know how Facebook, if you're on Facebook, it reminds you of your memories, right? So I've had all these Symposium memories over the last week or so, because we always had it in January, including all these pictures from 2020, and I'm looking at them thinking, we had no idea the world was going to end in about 6 weeks. Who knew that it would be 3 years before we could do this again, but we're glad we can. Very, very glad to welcome you to this session with my colleague, Deborah Haarsma. I think Deb is probably known to most of you. I was just remarking to her about another person in this room who's a wonderful musician, but Deb is also a very good musician. She was, I think, a music major at college, as well as science and physics. And so Deb, for many years, taught here at Calvin, taught physics, but chiefly astronomy. Here at Calvin, and did that for many, many years. And then several years ago, she was invited to become the president of Biologos. And if you don't know about Biologos, and Deb could say more about it, but it was an organization founded by Francis Collins, who has been in the news a lot in recent years with the National Institutes of Health, and his role in the pandemic was key, and he's been an advisor to the presidents, and he has been advising President Biden on science as well. So he founded this. If you ever read Francis's book, The Language of God, he explains what he means by Biologos, and so he founded this organization. For a lot of years, it was also led by a man named Darrell Folk, and now Deb's been president of it for a number of years, and they are at the crossroad of a lot of conversations, particularly conversations on faith and science, worship and science. And so we're very, very happy that Deb, who's very busy, was able to find time to come here today. And we are here to talk about something that's been much in the news, but far, far better to look at pictures from the Webb Telescope. So, Deb, welcome to you. And we do, by the way, we've got 75 minutes in this session, so we do hope to have some time for questions. And I think they just set up a stationary mic there, so that if you do have a question when we get there, you can make your way to the mic. That way, everybody can hear you. But Deb, welcome. And before we get to the images, which we'll spend most of our time on, just maybe say a couple things. What has excited someone like you, physicists, astrophysicists, astronomers? What has excited you about Webb, what Webb has already done, and what it might still do?
Yeah. So this is a very exciting time in astronomy. Actually, the last few decades, with the amazing spacecraft and ground-based telescopes, astronomy is just moving forward by leaps and bounds. And with the Webb Telescope, it's been very long in coming, and it is uniquely designed to address a couple of big scientific questions. One of those is studying planets around other stars. We've discovered many planets around other stars, but to actually image them more precisely and learn more about them, that's what Webb is capable to do. And another big design goal is to see the earliest galaxies in the universe, and I'll be showing some pictures of that. It is moving us forward in dramatic ways, and everybody's excited about it. There are many other instruments and new telescopes and other developments in astronomy, but this is definitely the highlight of 2022 and probably 2023 as the results start to come in.
And how high is its orbit above Earth? Is it 1 million miles?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so let me show you a couple things. So here's a diagram of the launch, a photo of the launch, which was on Christmas Day just over a year ago. I got up early before the rest of the family to watch that, and just, fingers crossed, please don't blow up, because this was 20 years in the making, something like $10 billion. And it was just too big to fail, and thankfully it did not fail. The launch went off perfectly, and the whole telescope had to unfold. There were many individual points of failure, but none of them failed. It all unfolded out in space, and it had to travel further out. So you can see it's out here, well beyond Earth's orbit. The Webb is actually orbiting the sun, and it is 1 million miles away from Earth, and that's 4 times further than the moon. And it's out there in space. So do you want to see a little about the capabilities here? Here's a close-up.
Yeah, and maybe also, Hubble launched, I think, about 33 years ago.
Yes.
I always remember when Hubble launched, same year I got married. So if I can remember my anniversary, I know how old Hubble is. And Hubble was great, but what are the advances of Webb vis-a-vis Hubble?
Yeah, and this is really important because a lot of people think, well, this is replacing Hubble, and it is not. So the unique thing about the Webb telescope is that it observes at infrared wavelengths. So do you see the mirror there? It looks gold. That's because it's actually made of gold, and that's because gold is very reflective in infrared wavelengths. So infrared, if you've been to a restaurant that has heat lamps shining down on the food, you put your hand under there, you can feel the heat. That's infrared radiation. And the galaxies and stars emit infrared radiation as well. And there's a lot of information in that that is not in the wavelengths that the Hubble Space Telescope uses, which uses the wavelengths our eyes see, plus a little bit ultraviolet. And Hubble will still be around, and a lot of images, they're imaging the same fields Hubble took pictures of, so they can do a direct comparison.
And Hubble's at a much lower orbit, right? I mean, the space shuttle's been able to get to it to fix it.
Yes, and Hubble is right just 90 miles above the Earth, much closer than the Moon, and accessible with the space shuttle. So that's the wonderful thing about Hubble, is we've been able to repair it and update the instruments. So the instruments on Hubble are only a few years old. There's no repairing or modifying the Webb telescope. It was a one-shot, so this is what we have. The other thing about it is this big silvery thing here, that's about the size of a tennis court, and it has 5 thin layers to protect it from the heat radiation of the sun. So on the sunward side, it's about 230 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the telescope side, it's like minus 390 or something. So about the temperature difference from Florida, where I was earlier this week, to Michigan. Not
Roughly.
quite, but yeah. So that's protecting it from the heat radiation. So this is near absolute zero and able to detect the faintest infrared signals from space. The other thing that's different from Hubble is, well, let's show you what happens when you move into space. Because here, for telescopes on the ground, they're looking through the atmosphere. Come on. This is an example, just for comparison, of what a photo might look like from Earth. So looking through the atmosphere, here's a lovely quintet of galaxies. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 entire galaxies. And a galaxy has billions of stars in it. Our own galaxy is the Milky Way, that the sun and the Earth orbit around the Milky Way. But these are entirely separate galaxies. And then there's also lots of stars here in the foreground that we're looking past to see these distant galaxies, which are a couple 100 million light years away. So, but what happens when you go above the atmosphere? Here's the Webb image. You see the difference in the detail? It's incredible. So you still see the same 5 galaxies, but now you can see this one has all these beautiful structures in it. You see this big stream of material being pulled out from these galaxies. And that material there, there's a lot of glowing dust in that material. So a lot of what we see at infrared wavelength is dust that's warm and just giving off that little bit of heat radiation. And then you see brilliant stars and also entire other there's a little spiral galaxy right there. There. More galaxies. I love galaxies. You're going to see a lot of those.
And probably everybody here knows this, but just as we continue here, we get the vocabulary straight. So
yes, please.
We are in the Milky Way galaxy. This is our home galaxy, right?
Yep.
Our sun is a star, one of about a billion or so stars in the Milky Way. Most of what we see in the night sky is all Milky Way.
Yes.
But what Webb is showing so there are stars, right, within a galaxy, and then there are whole galaxies with a billion or so of their own stars, right?
Yeah.
When we see these galaxies,
that looks kind of like the Milky Way right there.
Yeah,
only it's probably a billion light years away.
Yeah. So that's mind blowing. We'll keep going. But yeah, keep going. Just narrate us through some images and.
Yeah. Okay. So a little bit more about Hubble. So here's the difference in the visible light versus infrared light. If you want another infrared space telescope, you have to go back to Spitzer, which launched in 2003 and was state of the art at that time. But look at how small Spitzer's mirror is compared to Webb's mirror. And that size of the mirror makes a huge difference. And this is the difference it makes. That's a Spitzer image, that's a Webb image. This is why astronomers are excited, okay? Like we can see stuff we just have not been able to see. What looks like a blob here turns out to be a star. This blob turns out to be, again, a galaxy of hundreds of billions of stars. So that's a bit of the difference it makes. So here's another comparison. This is the Orion Nebula from the Webb Telescope. Now, a nebula is something within our galaxy. So we said our galaxy has hundreds of billions of stars. It also has clouds of gas and dust. All that space in between the stars isn't entirely empty. It has these clouds in it. And in a nebula like this, the bright stars are lighting up the gas and the dust and causing it to glow in these beautiful colors. So nebulae, they're as beautiful as any sunset on Earth. They can just be jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And so what you see here is all of this, that's a big band of dust there. And there's some very bright stars off to that side that are causing this whole region to glow. For comparison,
By the way, the Orion Nebula, with a decent ground telescope, you can see it, right? It's in the Orion constellation, kind of in the sword, isn't it? Is that where-
yeah. So the Orion constellation is up right now, not right now, it's morning, but in the evenings here in the winter, you can get a great shot, a great view of Orion. It's in the southern sky. And I didn't check the forecast, it's probably still raining tonight, but maybe tomorrow night you can have a look. And Orion has those distinctive 3 stars in its, that's kind of like the belt, and then it's got sort of 2 stars for the shoulder of the man and 2 stars for the feet of the man, and it's got a little sword, you can see. And the Orion Nebula is actually the middle star of the sword of Orion.
Is Betelgeuse one of those stars? In
Yes. Yeah, very good.
I listened to you for a long time.
Yeah, Betelgeuse, Rigel. Yep. So this is another comparison, a direct comparison of Hubble versus Webb. And you can see Hubble's pretty good. It's a pretty sharp picture because it's a good space telescope. But what you see, what do you see different here in the Webb one versus this one? It's a little bluer, but you also see more stars. Look at all those stars. And that's because starlight and infrared wavelengths can pass through those clouds in between the stars. So the starlight passes through. The stars are here kinda, but they're pretty faint, and here they come through much more brilliantly. So we can peer inside of these nebulae. And that allows us to see, whoops, sorry, my pointer got excited. A baby star. This is a star in the process of forming. So one thing I love about these nebulae is they're stellar nurseries. So what you have, these clouds of gas and dust, you get a knot of the dust that's particularly dense, and it'll be swirling around, and it'll start to collapse under gravity. So gravity's pulling all that material in, and it gets denser and denser. And when it gets to the very core of it, you have a protostar. And when that protostar gets dense enough, then nuclear fusion turns on, and then that's when the star is born. Once the nuclear fusion turns on, the star is shining brightly, and it starts to blow away the remains of the cloud, and then you see the star in space. So new stars are being born all the time.
God keeps making them.
God, and that's the interesting theological point. God is still creating new stars. So, I mean, do you want to speak to that from the theological side? Like, creation isn't a once and done thing, it's still happening.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that has gotten obscured, I think, in the church over the years with all the arguments over origins and all that. And age of the universe in particular has been a hot topic. And because of that, we focus on creation as though it was what God did, you know, whether it was 6 24-hour days or whatever it was, right? But in the tradition of the church, there's been a very, very important doctrine called creatia continua, continual creation. That God never, creation was not one and done for God. God is still creating continually. It's a major doctrine, lots of major theologians. Thomas Aquinas, you can find it all over the place. So that the fact that God is still making daisies, and he's still making babies, and he's still making stars, stands to reason. It's also why, and I think it was Walter Brueggemann who maybe first, alerted me to this, but in Genesis 1, of course, God makes light before he makes any proximate source of light. God just makes light. no sun, stars. And so then you get a little bit farther down, like on the fourth day of creation, and there's just this wonderful, especially now that we know how many stars there are in our Milky Way alone, what you see in the night sky is a drop in the bucket, right? Not to mention now that we know there are billions of other whole galaxies with billions of stars. But there's just this great line in Genesis 4, he made the stars also. Oh yeah, by the way, God made stars. Moving on, it's like, whoa, hold on. There is so much in that casual little line is just a wallop of wonder. And yeah, the fact that stars are still being born in nebulae is wonderful.
Yeah, I really love it. So that's one of the things that, as a Christian and an astronomer looking at this, as an astronomer, I see new stars being born, and then as a Christian, I can think about God is still creating and see God's creative work in process. You know, God could just snap his fingers and make a new star. Could totally happen. But he instead chooses to do it through this process that we get to watch, and using some of the ingredients he made earlier, this gas and dust that he made, and then making it into a new star through processes we can understand.
My friend, I do a radio and podcast program for the Christian Reformed Church called Groundwork, and my co-host Daryl Delaney has used this line before. He said, you know, we live in a microwave culture. You know, we want everything done like, you know, snap your fingers. God's a crockpot God. God is a low and slow God, right? He didn't just, you know, beam his son down here as a fully grown man. He started with a zygote and, you know, worked with the baby, you know, and all that stuff. And God does seem to like to work through long haul processes. It's still God's work, and now and then God will, if need be, do that snap your finger miracle, but ordinarily, crockpot.
Yeah. And so what we see God working in Scripture through those slow processes matches what we see looking in space, which I think really speaks to how it's the same God revealing himself in his word and his world. Let's see, you want to see some more?
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Oh, here's Neptune. I think they just pointed this at Neptune for fun. This is one of the early images they released. And did you know Neptune has rings? We actually learned that with the Voyager spacecraft back in the day. But we haven't had a good image of Neptune's rings in years. So to have a look at that, it looks kind of like Saturn. Saturn's the one with the rings that you can see even from a ground-based telescope. But to get a look at those is great. And took a snapshot of Jupiter. So this is Jupiter at infrared wavelengths. Usually we're used to looking at visible. What color are you used to seeing Jupiter? Yeah, kind of reddish, brownish, maybe a little yellow. Used to seeing this spot looking red. Well, this is wavelengths our eyes can't see, so you just have to color code it to something. And they picked this sort of purpley palette here. And what it's showing you is that the brighter colors are brighter, and this gray cloud is at a warmer temperature and emitting more infrared than the rest. And then you get this cool stuff around the poles, and that's actually its version of northern lights. So who's seen the northern lights here on Earth? Yeah, see a little bit, you know. So it's better the further north you go, but that's an effect of the solar wind getting caught up in Earth's magnetic field, which funnels those particles to the poles, and they slam into our atmosphere, and the atmosphere glows a bit. It's an astronomical phenomena in that sense. And the same thing happens on Jupiter. Particles from the sun are getting slammed in there near the poles, and they're starting to glow. So you can see it out in space. So I just gave you a scientific explanation. I usually like to pause and make this point, that a scientific explanation does not replace God. And man, that idea is just, I don't know, it's in the air in our culture. That if science explains it, then we don't need God anymore. Okay? And people are like, well, you know, now we've got science. As if God were only in the gaps in our scientific knowledge, which is such an impoverished view of God. Yeah. So instead, when you have a scientific explanation, it's actually showing us the how of how God is governing creation. And then through telescopes, these tools of science, we actually reveal more about what God is doing than we knew before.
Yeah, I think that, you understand the instinct, right? I mean, I understand the instinct too, but I think in the early days when science, astronomy, but also evolutionary science in the 19th, early 20th centuries was coming on. I think the church, we did kind of go for the God of the gaps idea that every time science said, stopped and had to scratch its chin and say, yeah, I don't know how that happens. That's God. You'll never explain that. Problem is, 2 weeks later they did explain it, right? And I think that is one of the reasons science has been seen as such a threat, because it seems like we're on the run from it. Whereas if you just say, God does all of it, the stuff you can explain, the stuff you can't explain, the stuff you'll explain 100 years from now, the stuff you might never explain, it's just all God. I mean, it's all God's handiwork. So science is just, I mean, even as far back as Augustine, would talk about the vestiges, the vestigial fingerprints of God. And that's really ultimately what science is doing. And so science doesn't have to be seen as a threat if we see that what science discovers is just as much God as the stuff that we can't yet explain.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I love how you bring that into your preaching. So we've been co-presenting for a long time. You talk about how that sort of posture is almost more caught than taught, by just bringing science into preaching, not science about controversy, but about Jupiter or whatever you. Yeah. Those two.
Yeah, I do think that preachers and teachers can help a lot by frequent positive uses of scientific knowledge and data and discovery from the pulpit. You don't have to call attention to it, right? It's more caught than taught. But I think that it just on a I think, Neil, if a few of you may have been in Neil Plantinga's preaching session yesterday afternoon at the seminary, and Neil talked about something that I've talked about, that for preachers in particular, individual sermons aren't remembered for long, even the ones people liked, right? They actually don't remember them that long. But the arc of your preaching, right, the residue that builds up week after week, month after month, year after year, that's what sticks with people. And so if they're used to a preacher who just regularly, just positively celebrates some wonderful thing science has taught us or medicine has brought us, people kind of pick up after a while that, the science isn't the boogeyman. There's some good stuff there. It may raise some questions, and there are some scientists who are problems in terms of how making fun of religion. But I do think that there is something to that.
Yeah. And I think it means a lot to the high school students. They're sitting in science class every day during the week, and then if the minister says, hey, I just read, heard about a discovery of a new kind of dinosaur, and says two things about it, moves on, the kids will be like, whoa, we can talk about that in church? That's so cool. Or, just whatever the science might be. And I think it means a lot in just setting that sort of tone. It is... for me as a scientist, if the only time in church science is brought up is because there's a challenge and a controversy, it's just kind of demoralizing, because I'm seeing God as creator through all of this stuff. So, well, right, you want to see more pictures. What do we got here? Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is the Southern Ring Nebula, and this is a star near the end of its life. Now, you've probably heard of supernova explosions. So a star goes boom, and over the course of a few weeks, all of its material is spread out into space. This is a different thing. Most stars actually will end their lives more like this. And this is over thousands of years, the outer layers of the star just kind of drift away. So you get the kind of ring after ring of gas and dust going out into space. And then you have a star in the middle. This is actually, the star you're seeing is the binary companion of the actual dying star, but it's kind of lighting up that nebula from the inside. And so you see this beautiful ring of emission. So that's the end of a star's life. I mentioned a little bit about stars being born. I had to show you this nebula too. I mean, look at that. It's just so beautiful. This is called the Tarantula Nebula. I think it's as beautiful as any abstract painting of art or any sunset. And it's things like that that just make you go, the heavens declare the glory of God. And it's the glory of God, not just its own glory, but the glory of the one who made it.
How big is that?
How big is that? I believe this is 340 light years across from side to side.
So it's a hike. Oh.
Yeah, it is. And so what would the solar system be? You're seeing lots of stars here. So really the smallest dots you can see there are about the size of our solar system, or bigger than that, actually. So, yeah. You can see these, remember I said that these nebulas are where stars are born? That blue cluster of stars there, that's a bunch of newborn stars. And that bluish color to them, stars that are blue are very hot and they don't live very long. So when you see blue stars, it means they're newborns, kind of like a baby blue star there. And then this nebula, there's still stars being born in it. The researchers highlighted, oh, no, I didn't have, it's like right in here, if you read about this image online, they highlight this little knot region there of where they're seeing some of those protostars right in the process of forming. So the formation process is pretty slow, though. Maybe takes a million years for a star to form, that process where the collapses down and forms a star. And then the star might live for billions of years after that. So it's very much a slow motion, slow cooker kind of thing.
And this is far enough away that the baby stars we're seeing here in this moment are probably full-grown stars by now.
Let's see. This is about 160,000 light years away. So we're seeing it not as it is now, but as it was 160,000 years ago. Yeah, there's probably a couple stars per year being born in that cluster. So the cluster might have faded a bit, but it's probably still going.
Yeah.
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 So we've been tossing around timescales. Should we talk a little about Genesis?
Sure.
I love Genesis 1. It is a beautiful, compact story of how God created, and an account that really emphasizes God's sovereignty. There's this one God who's making all of these things. I grew up in an evangelical church, back when evangelical meant evangelism. We did door-to-door evangelism stuff. Frightened me. But that's what evangelical meant then. Church 3 times a week. Wonderful church. Learn to love God. But basically, we only knew of 2 ways of understanding this. Either God made it in 6 24-hour days, literally, or atheism. And there was no God at all. And, well, but choosing between those 2, I'm going to go with the one that has God. And I was fine with that until I got into, it was actually graduate school, where I started thinking about, boy, I really love this astronomy stuff. I'm going to have to figure out what's going on here. So it was reading biblical scholars that made the difference, Old Testament scholars. Do you want to say a little about, I don't know, the Old Testament, the Hebrew understanding of Genesis 1? They didn't view the world like we view it today.
No, I mean, the cosmology, if you want to even put it that way, the worldview, I mean, it's pretty clear, right, in Genesis 1, right, it's pretty clear that insofar as they had a cosmology, insofar as they had a thought, I always sort of say it's sort of like a snow globe submerged in a bathtub of water, right? So you've got the solid earth right beneath our feet, right? And then you got the dome of the firmament. So the firmament is where all the stars live, and the moon, and maybe 2, right? But Earth is flat. We got a plastic, as it were, a see-through firmament over top of us, and then the whole thing is sort of in water. So that's why the Bible talks about the waters over the earth and the waters under the earth. And when the flood happened, God removed the barrier so that it rained. But also, you notice in Genesis 6, the water came up, right? Because there's a water under the earth, right? So that was sort of the view. And I think it's clear from probably everybody who wrote the Bible, and, you know, this is what they knew. Old Testament and New Testament believed in a flat earth. And probably some version of that kind of cosmology. The sun, and this is very clear at how the imagery in Psalm 19 is used. The sun is inside the firmament, and it goes over top, and then at night it scoots underneath the flat part of the earth, and then runs its course again the next day, and then scoots underneath. That's when it's dark, and, you know, back again. So the idea of a solar system, the idea of this kind of reach of near infinite space, those kind of distances, the time that it takes for a starlight to get to our eyeballs, just wasn't known. And it wasn't all that important because to know, right? I mean, if God had wanted people to know that, he just said, oh, look, here, time out, let me draw you a new picture. The main thing is to know that God did it all, right? And so Genesis is there for theological purposes. And of course, Genesis is also there for polemical purposes. I think all of you who are preachers, and maybe a lot of you know this, right? But Walter Brueggemann in his interpretation series commentary is really good on this, that Genesis 1 in particular, 2 a little bit too, but 1 in particular is really a feisty piece of polemic against other religions, right?
Yeah.
So the Egyptians worshipped Re, the sun god. Author of Genesis says, the real God of Israel, he created a light without the sun. He'll make that 4 days from now. And that'll be like, no problem. God makes light without needing, approximate source. God can make plants grow before there is a sun even. Well, what about photosynthesis? Well, they didn't know about that either. But in other words, they're tilting against, the Enuma Elish and other creation narratives common in the ancient Near East in Israel's day to say that, no, Yahweh, the God of Israel, did it all. And that is the main point. And the how is less important than the who. In the Bible. I think that's some of what's going on there. So the idea of cosmic scale, like the way we think of it today, or even the thought that someone could travel to the moon and go about 265,000 miles or wherever it is to the moon, would have been, whatever the moon was, it wasn't landable.
Right, yeah. Not something very different than the terrestrial substance. Yeah, thank you. And what I finally concluded when I started learning about all that, this was all news to me when I was like a graduate student reading all this, and I was like, wow, how come nobody ever told me that? And I eventually decided if God wasn't trying to put scientific information into Genesis 1, then I didn't need to try to get scientific information out of Genesis 1, but instead focus on the points that were the main point that God was conveying to them. So it's, if anything, Genesis 1 is a commentary on scientism, of scientists thinking that we don't need God at all. No, it's saying there is a creator who created all of these things, and they're all under his sovereignty. Let me just mention a few resources to go with that. So my husband and I wrote this book, Origins, where we review everything about creation, evolution, and design. It has some nice short videos to go with it. And of course, Scott Hoezee's excellent book on preaching, engaging science on Sunday, which has a much bigger scope than just these origins questions. If you're looking for things to follow, I just started on Instagram, so if you want to see more astronomy images in your feed, you're welcome to follow me there. And while we're doing plugs, I'll also plug BioLogos, where I'm the president, and as said, Francis Collins founded BioLogos. We talk about many different topics, but we bring together in all of them a Christ-centered faith with rigorous science, and we aim to do it in a spirit of gracious dialogue. If you want to learn more about BioLogos, welcome to check us out at biologos.org, or go on the QR code and subscribe to our emails, and then you can pick weekly or monthly updates to hear about our content. And yeah, we do lots of stuff. So we do creation care things and some biomedical things, and just featuring lots of scientists who are believers. Yeah. Okay, back to astronomy.
Yep.
Oh, I love this galaxy. I like all the galaxies. Okay, but this one is like the Cartwheel Galaxy, which has, it looks like a cartwheel. And that's because it had a collision with another galaxy a while back that sent out this ring of material, and you combine that with its spiral arms, and you get this beautiful cartwheel shape.
What happens when galaxies collide? I mean, it must be kind of slow motion for one thing.
Yes.
But
yep.
Kind of what happens?
Right,
I always wonder,
yeah.
what happens? I mean, do they blow up? Do they combine? Do they destroy tons of stuff? I mean, it sounds like bad. You wouldn't want to live there when it happens.
Well, yeah, so when two rocky planets collide, or an asteroid hits the moon or something, then, things do start to blow up. You got two solid objects. Galaxies, it's more like a neighborhood. It's got all of these stars, but lots of empty spaces in between the stars. So the stars just kind of, they all come along and sort of pass through each other, and it's more their gravitational interaction, and they all start swirling around. Some get flung way out, some end up orbiting close, and you get this tangled look to all of these streams of stellar material. But gravity's the big governing thing going on, and eventually all of them will come into orbit around one new galaxy. So they end up merging. So if two spiral galaxies come together, all those spiral arms get messed up in the process, and it ends up being one big glob and an elliptical galaxy in the end. Yeah. And you get a little bit of fireworks because those gas clouds in between the stars, they do slam into each other and new stars are formed. So you get a little bit of fireworks. Okay, so I want to show you a bit of that scope of the vast universe. So this is the moon to scale. So picture the moon. We're going to look at this little square. And they've been saying this. It's the size of a grain of sand at arm's length. The full moon is like smaller than your pinky fingernail at arm's length. It looks big in the sky, but if you hold up your finger to it, it's kind of small. But if you hold up a little grain of sand at arm's length, that's the field of view of the Webb Telescope. The images it makes all fit into that tiny space. So both Webb and Hubble love to look at images that were blank. There's nothing in there. There's no bright stars, no bright galaxies. It looks basically blank because we want to see what's the wallpaper behind all of this. Is it just empty? What's there? Well, it's not empty. It looks like that. This was the first image released last July from the Webb Telescope. It's the one the president showed when announcing the telescope. And this is filled with lots of stuff. We have a lot of stars here, so these would be foreground stars in our galaxy, all with Webb's unique 6-pointed, actually 8-pointed array there. And then you have all of these distant galaxies. This is actually a cluster of galaxies. This big one here in the middle, that's a big blobby one, that would be about 1,000 times the size of the Milky Way. That would be more closer to the size of the Milky Way if we were out there. So yeah, pretty big. And it's not static either. These galaxies are all in orbit around their common center of gravity, so they're all moving around. But the streaks that you see are actually things in the background that are getting distorted by the incredible mass that is present here. It's very massive, and that mass is distorting space-time and causing these galaxies behind to curl into these pretty arcs here. So lots going on in this image. Let me show you another one that's a little more a typical region of space. And this is several Webb images strung together. It's more like a grain of sand at arm's length. And this is more typical. There's no clusters here particularly, but just this is the wallpaper of the universe. That's what it all looks like in the background. It's not empty. And it gives you a feel for how many millions and billions of galaxies there are out there. Kind of the God's eye picture of our vast universe. So let's talk about that vastness a bit. No, okay, right. First, tell you, I got to give you the other dimension. So this is looking across in space. Now, some of what you're seeing here is nearby, and some is further away. And they haven't made a movie of this for the Webb images yet, but they did for Hubble. So this is a Hubble deep field image, and they tagged each of the objects in it for how far away it is. And then they made a movie as if you're flying through it. So we're going to fly through space here. Going past the nearby stuff. Pause here a moment. Beautiful spiral galaxy here, 5 billion light years away. So we're seeing it as it was 5 billion years ago. And here's another one. Yeah, 7 billion years. So we're going earlier in the history of the universe, and it looks a little clumpier. Check out another one here. Oh, this one looks really clumpy. 10-some billion years ago. Galaxies from Hubble's view, we weren't seeing those nice spiral ones further back in time. This is the most distant galaxy that Hubble was able to find in this deep field, 12.7 billion years ago. The universe itself would be 13.8 billion years old, so it's going back to that very early epoch in the universe. And that's as much as we could see with Hubble. That was it. And astronomers were like, we need another telescope. And so they built the Webb Telescope specifically to see the galaxies more distant than this, because you can also see it's reddish in color, and that's the effect of traveling through this expanding universe shifts them all to redder wavelengths and into the infrared part of the spectrum. So we really need an infrared telescope, and we need a nice big mirror, and that's what Webb has. And so the results have started to come out, and they started to release them last fall. This came out just last month, We're starting to get some of the early peer-reviewed stuff now. And this is what they were picking out of. So each of these is one of those grain of sand images. And within each, they're highlighting here some of the earliest galaxies they're seeing in the universe. And yeah, some of them are these weird clumpy things like Hubble saw. But then here, look at this one. It's a real nice disky spiral one. And like, what's up with that? So they're seeing galaxies that look different than we expected. And they're seeing more of them. There's more galaxies here in this early part of the universe than we expected. These are two big surprises. Now, do the astronomers all freak out and say, oh no, all of our theories are wrong? Well, no, we say, well, some of our theories are wrong. And we don't say, oh no, we're like, oh goody. We get to do more research now. It means we don't understand everything yet. Let's be curious. Let's figure out what's going on. There's more research to be done. And that's a really neat posture to have, and about life and about even theological or biblical questions. Like you come across something you don't understand, and we don't have to freak out. We can say, well, there's some core things I still understand, but this piece I don't, but maybe I can be curious and explore what God is doing there that I don't understand.
Well, I think that, I mean, science is in the business of putting itself out of business, right? I mean, science is in the business of proving itself wrong. And I mean, and the longer something doesn't prove wrong, the stronger the theory gets, right?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people don't understand that science doesn't just say, oh, found that, figured it out, now we're done. No, they're always testing it, pushing the limits. And, I think that's one thing you and I have talked about before. I forgot to mention earlier that years ago, a little over 10 years ago, Calvin Seminary got a grant from the Templeton Foundation to develop science and faith resources, and Deb and I co-directed that. Deb was still at the college, at Calvin College, in the astronomy department at the time. And we talked about some of this, but that one of the things that I think becomes very clear in the Bible, but also I think one of the things that becomes very clear when you just look around you, right, is that human beings are the only creatures on the earth that we know of, and one of the only ones in the universe that we know of, who are curious.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, go to the Heckman Library here on campus and go up to the science section, and you'll find bookshelves sagging under the weight of books on, weeds of the Midwest, moths of Montana, right? I mean, we're cataloging everything because we're curious, right? My wife and I used to go snorkeling in the Caribbean, and we would catalog in our mind every new fish we saw. And we'd go back to the room and get our reef fish identification book. That was a parrotlight, a stoplight parrotfish, right? That was a midnight parrotfish. I haven't seen that one before. I'm a birder, so I got a life list of birds. Other animals don't do that, right? I mean, when we walk through the woods, the white-tailed deer doesn't say, oh, there goes a Caucasian female with blonde hair. Never seen one of those before. I want to write that down. And that, I think the Bible says, is the image of God in us.
Yeah.
God takes delight in God's creation. What was the seventh day of creation? God was tired? No, God just sat back and enjoyed all those birds and fish and stars and nebula and galaxies he'd made on the first 6 days, right? So I think that is the spark of God in us, that we're curious. And, the irony is there are some atheists or agnostic scientists, and there are some militantly atheist scientists who don't appreciate being told, you know why you're such a good scientist? God. They don't like to hear that at all. Don't say that to Richard Dawkins. He doesn't like that. But it is, who is it? Wilson, right?
E.O. Wilson?
E.O. Wilson, who has spent his life studying the leafcutter ant, right? And he was on NPR a while back. He waxed eloquent. I love the leafcutter ant. I'm in love with this ant. I mean, he's very not pro-religion, right? But I mean, it's sort of like, man, the very fact that you're interested in a leafcutter ant, have spent your life, and now you've fallen in love with it, you're proposed to it or something. That's the spark of God in you, whether you know it or not. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. We bring these kind of people onto the BioLogos podcast, Christians, but one who just loves beetles, another one going on about dragonflies and what a spiritual experience it was to see those, the sea turtles. There's just so much. So you hear me going on about galaxies, but people go on about everything. Yeah. Genetics is stunningly amazing.
Talk a bit, and if you were
Yeah.
going to get to this, just say, hold on a minute. But so a lot of us here know, as far as we know, nothing travels faster than light. About 186,000 miles per second per second. I mean, it's really, really fast. Sound travels about 600 something, right? Which is why if you see fireworks in the distance, you see the firework go off, and a minute later you hear the boom, right?
Yeah.
Sound goes slow. Light is so we know. And a light year is how fast a beam of light travels in a year. It's a
Yep.
distance, not a time, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so we know that something that's a million light years away, the light that hits your eyeball tonight when you look at it, was traveling here for 1 million years.
Yes.
Two questions. Well, I'll start with one. So we know that, but how do we figure out that it is 100 million light years away?
Oh,
how
yeah.
how do we figure out that that galaxy is 5.8 billion light years from us? How do we figure out how far away something is? We know how long, it's easy to figure out, oh yeah, the light just keeps traveling. It just took a while to get here, but how do we know
Yeah.
where it started,
Right.
distance-wise?
This has been a major research achievement of the 20th century. And because it's not easy, because, yeah, you can't just run a tape measure out and figure out how far away it is. So you kind of bootstrap your way up. So in the solar system, we can bounce a radar signal off of like Venus and have it come back. And so we can measure that pretty directly. And we have a model of the solar system, so we can kind of figure out our distances there. But then what you do is you use the motion of the Earth around the sun kind of changes our vantage point. So you're all going to try this out. So hold up your finger at arm's length and then open one eye and then the other eye. Do you see your finger moving against the background? First it's in front of one thing and then it's in front of another thing. That, my friends, is parallax. And the two eyes are like the Earth at two different positions, say on one side of the sun versus the other side of the sun, you know, we're moving. And as we move, something in the foreground appears to move compared to things in the background. And so we can actually see, we can just do the geometry then and figure out how far away that stuff is. And then you're on your way. You look at the brightness of those objects, and you compare, you know their distance. You look at how luminous they are and the brightness, and you learn stuff about them, and then you look at similar objects further away, and you get their distance, and you kind of bootstrap your way up, and eventually figure out, yeah, one of those galaxies is that far away. For these most distant ones, we're using the expansion of space itself, and that effect where it causes it to look redder than it is, and we can measure that and figure out how far away it is from that. It's easier when I have diagrams to show you all that stuff, so I won't.
Yeah, that's pretty
But does
easy.
that give you a feel for it?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Sure.
I believe you. I'll put it that way.
But yeah, I think maybe that's what I want to convey is there is a lot of work behind it and a lot of detailed work and a whole lot of debate in the scientific community of are we getting it right? And in fact, there's two communities of astronomers vigorously debating right now like a 10% difference when their error bars are like 3%, and they're like, no, what's going on? What's going on? So yeah, it's not just a guess.
Yeah. And then one other question on this, just because it's something I think some of us think about. So we have sisters and brothers in Christ, and some of you here maybe today, right, who believe in young earth creationism, and that the universe is only so old and not that old, right?
Yeah.
And it goes without saying that this kind of thing, saying, well, the light that hits your eye tonight's been traveling for 1 million years, that's problematic. And so different theories have been tried out to say, to try to explain it away or explain it differently. Maybe you could talk about what some of those are and sort of where the challenge points are.
Yeah. One of the big ones there is people will say that God created the light in motion on its way to us. So God created everything 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, but all the stuff we're seeing at great distances, God made those things too, but he made the light already on its way to us, and then now it's just arriving here. There's no scientific way to prove that's wrong. And that really becomes actually more of a theological question. Is that something God would do to make it look like it was leaving those objects millions of years ago when actually the light was already in motion? So that's one of the theories. But that one's actually consistent with the scientific evidence, which is one reason I raise it. As some of the other ones, they actually dispute a lot of the evidence. Sometimes they'll look at one thing that scientists are debating, say these very early galaxies, and say, scientists can't explain that, so all of their theories are wrong, and this young Earth perspective is right. Which is actually not the case. One piece of our theories is wrong, but the rest of it is still in place. But I know Christians, I've listened to talks by theologians and biblical scholars who are like, I know all that scientific evidence is there, but my reading of Scripture, I believe this just is the best reading, and that eventually we'll figure out what's going on with the science. And that's a theological choice that people make, and that's fine. So,
say something you taught me a while ago, that sort of becomes theologically problematic. That a beam of light that's been traveling for a million years isn't just a beam of light.
Right, okay, yeah. So within that beam of light, there's stuff happening. There's whole supernova explosions. There's an incredible amount of detail. There's a whole history of each object showing what it's doing, stars in the process of forming. So I should have mentioned that. So it's not just that it's a little bit of starlight coming to us, it's a whole history of the universe coming to us. And so then it becomes like God is making it look like the universe is really that old and has all of that rich history built into it, but then asking us to believe that it's not actually there. So it's kind of like as if God created everything last Tuesday, including all the stuff in the museums that shows there's an Earth history, but the history didn't actually happen. It's just in our heads. That's what it feels like to me as an astronomer, because the history embedded in all of that light is incredibly rich.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds absurd, but it's actually impossible. I mean, so you all got out of bed this morning and you put your feet on the floor and you knew you weren't going to fall through the floor, that it would hold, and you know that because that's been going on for your life for 40, 50, 60 years. But there is no logical way to disprove the possibility that God created the whole universe yesterday, including all the memories you have in your head, your parents, your growing up years, your having stepped on floorboards before that didn't give way. There's no way to disprove that logically. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that would mean God is fooling you. He's given you a whole history that never really happened.
Yeah.
And would God do that? So a beam of light tells a story, but if it was created in motion 6,000 years ago, then 99.9% of that story is fake. It never really happened. But using the best of the abilities God gave us as image bearers of God, we see the story and have no way to know it's not true if in fact that's, the universe is created in motion. And that just doesn't sound like God to me, that he would create us curious, give us the abilities to investigate the universe, uncover all this stuff, and it's fake. Mm-hmm. And we have no way to know it, because by using our best God-given abilities, that's what we perceive. That's theologically problematic.
Yeah. So, which is something you can take so for you who are pastors and ministry leaders, a lot of the questions and concerns people have about science issues really come back to biblical questions, theological questions. And you might not feel equipped to talk about the science, but you know the Bible and theology. You can talk about those things, and that's helpful. And for young people, or really anyone coming to you with questions, they don't even always want it to have a pat answer all worked out. If you're not sure about something, you can say, well, let's explore together. Let's read a book and discuss it together. And what that means to a young person is, wow, the questions I care about, I can ask in church, and a mature adult Christian cares about them too and wants to explore them with me. That's huge for their faith development. So that's a posture you can have, whatever your view on any of these issues. You've mentioned a couple times about atheist scientists overreach, and we should talk a little bit more about that, and then we got to have some time for questions. My goodness, it's 9:25. This is a headline in The Atlantic last September: "Life is an accident in space and time." I'm like, what? So I started reading the article, and it's by a scientist, but the scientist wasn't actually saying that. He was saying it wasn't an accident, and somehow the editor just slipped into making that the headline. And this idea is still in our culture, that something about science is somehow showing that life is purposeless. And that's way overreach. That's going way beyond what scientific evidence can say. Like, science can say there are this many stars, it's this distance apart, but it can't say, therefore life is meaningless. So for that, we have to look beyond science. And so in a lot of ways, we need to look beyond science. It's not capable of answering so many important questions in our lives. And so then we, as Christians, we look to our faith. And this sort of question is right there in Scripture. In Isaiah 55, it says, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." And God is saying, yeah, there's a lot in this universe that's beyond you, which you get that even if you just go outside at a dark sky site and you look up at the stars, you get that feeling of, wow, the universe is bigger than me. And God says, that's true. My ways are higher than your ways, but there is a purpose. You might not know it yet. God has a purpose. He has ways even when we don't understand them. And I tell you, in times like 2020 with all the chaos going on, that was a comfort to me that God is not bound by all of our human strife and struggles and uncertainties. He's beyond all of that, governing this whole universe, and his ways are higher than our ways, and he's going to care for us.
I think, too, if you're interested in this area of science and theology and haven't seen it yet, the book to read it's probably the last book that Alvin Plantinga wrote, Where the Conflict Really Lies.
Oh, yeah.
And Plantinga has been brilliant taking on people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and the like, in saying that there is a conflict with Christianity, but not with science, but with scientific naturalism, where people like Richard Dawkins stop talking about science and start talking about teleology and philosophy, and they're claiming that they're science, but these are religious claims. And Al Plantinga's contention is scientific naturalism is every bit as much a religion as Christianity or Judaism. It's a religious commitment of the heart. It's not science, it's scientific naturalism, and that is a conflict with Christianity, but it's really hard sometimes to disentangle that for people, that where does the science stop and the naturalism begin, right? Where is Dawkins talking as a scientist, and where does he stop and start talking like a theologian? That's dicey, but Al Plantinga is really quite bright, so I think he's done a good job dealing with it. So,
Yes, indeed. And that's where, for me, hearing Christians who are scientists talk about their work is really helpful, because it is not laced with that whole atheistic worldview.
well, I don't know if you were here. It was somebody at Calvin a few years ago. There is also this pop conception of the church that most scientists are like Richard Dawkins because they make all the noise, right? So it's easy to think, oh yeah, but there was that woman who was here on campus. I can't remember her name. She had done a major study and found that like something just over 50% of people active in the sciences are people of faith, Christians, Jews, Muslims, but people with deep faith. It's not the case that even the majority of scientists are atheists or agnostics. A slight majority are actually people of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just the loud voices, so that are going off with all the atheism.
Yeah.
I want to make one more comment about worship planning, and then we should open it up for questions probably. The Sunday after the Webb Telescope images were released, my church, all they did was they picked a couple of scripture readings. They read Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him when I consider the heavens. And then they put these images up beside some creation hymns, and that was the opening worship. And it was so powerful. It really wasn't hard in a worship planning sense to just put that in front of people. And there's many of the classic hymns, and a lot of the cool newer worship songs do refer to the created order. And just pairing that with some of the science in the news is really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. 15 minutes. Questions. If you have a question, make your way to that microphone there. It should be hot. Yeah, we'd like to hear questions that Deb can field.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. One of the theological questions that, as I've thought about the vastness of the universe, which I think makes Isaiah 55 so much more meaningful than kind of the old Hebrew idea of what the world looked like. I think it magnifies his glory. But the theological issue that I struggle with is if there is other intelligent life out there,
Oh, yeah.
what does it mean for our faith if we believe, hey, Jesus was incarnate as a human being and he died to save? That's another pillar of our faith, our
Yep.
theological understanding. What does it mean for Zalaxians or whatever who are out there who are intelligent and they don't know Jesus? So maybe if you could speak to that a little, or maybe recommend some resources. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, thank you. This is a great question. And if you Google my name and this topic, you'll probably come across, there's a BioLogos article, and there's some lectures I've done on this, so you can get the longer version there. What would life beyond Earth mean for Christians? And it's good to be thinking about this before it happens. We don't need to be caught off guard if we actually discover intelligent life out there. I think it's good to remember there are a lot of different kinds of life that we know of even on Earth and in Scripture. And so even if there is life out there, it might be bacterial life. And even if it's intelligent life, God might relate to it very differently than he relates to us. God relates to animals differently than he does to us. God relates to angels differently than us. They fell, but they don't seem to have a salvation plan, So there's differences. Would these other creatures bear the image of God? That's an interesting question. But then you do get the case, what if they are similar enough to us that they would have a similar thing where God gives them commands, gives them free will, they sin, and then God chooses to do the same sort of redemption plan there? Would God become incarnate for them and give his life for them? I don't know. And theologians are speculating a full range on this, of that very question means there can't possibly be life out there, or life out there, no problem, Jesus could be incarnate and died many times. I think there's definitely room for discussion among those different options. So.
And C.S. Lewis messed with this in the Space Trilogy.
He had two different ideas.
Yeah.
Hey,
So Lewis, so if you haven't read the Space Trilogy, he messes around with this idea.
Mm-hmm.
Could there be worlds where there was never a fall?
Yeah.
But yeah, if there was a world with a fall, right? But yeah. And,
Yeah.
Would the other creatures also similar to us be made in the image of God? Yeah, those
Right.
are incredibly important. Not Klingons. I don't think the Klingons would be in the image of God.
Yeah, no.
They might be salvageable. There's always Worf. Anyway.
Good morning. Our culture is not very good at gracious conversations. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about BioLogos and that third bullet point of gracious
Yeah.
conversations.
Oh, thank you for raising that. This has just become more important than ever because especially with the way social media works, it just amps up negative emotions. Those are the things that get more likes and then spread more, and you get the most negative extreme comments that go out there, and you have a situation where you can taunt somebody else who you've never met and then have all of your friends applaud you with little emojis. That's just wrong. It's just not very good. So what does it take to do gracious dialogue? It takes seeing the other people as God's image bearers, always looking for, even though I disagree with a lot of what you're saying, what's something I do agree about? Is there some value we share underlying it? Asking the other person, and this comes up in church conversations, family conversations, over science things. Maybe it's climate change, maybe it's masks and vaccines. You've probably been in those conversations. Everybody's been talking about those things. But sometimes if you ask somebody why is this so important to you? And then try and get at, it might be well, I'm just so worried about my kids and their health. Or, or something. And then or I'm really worried about the interpretation of Scripture, or I'm worried about public policy in our country. And then often you can say, well, wow, I'm worried about that too. Maybe you can find some common ground at some underlying level. It's never right to talk about another person rather than their viewpoint, and maybe we slipped into that a little bit too here. We're trying to showcase some of the different views on the landscape, but I will say that for even hardcore atheists, a lot of them can be very nice people, and there's a lot of atheists who don't use the hardcore language. So there are complexities there as well. And it takes a lot of humility. It takes being willing to say, oh, I never thought of it that way, or, oh, I'm actually wrong about some aspect of that. Oh, I overstated my view there. And that's a spiritual discipline right there. So it's cultivating the fruit of the Spirit in our conversations. And not to say Biologos always gets this right either, but we strive for that sort of thing. And we try to showcase voices that are doing that well so that you can get some of those models in your mind of how that can be done.
Well, and I think too, you're right, to hear people out is so important. I remember years ago when you and Lauren, her husband Lauren, did a January series talk here.
Yeah.
On some of this very stuff, and on their Origins book in particular. And then remember after your lecture was done, you went and had lunch with the president at his house, and then I was left behind with 60 skeptical people.
Oh, that's right. You did Q&A afterwards.
Q&A. Yeah, I got no lunch. But one of the people there, whose daughter had just graduated with a biology degree here at Calvin, and the daughter was there too, but who was herself a young Earth creationist, and she said to me, maybe people like you, you think we believe what we do because you think we're stupid, you think we're dumb, and ignorant. I should have known I did. But when you talk to her, it's like the reason she thought that is she has run into a lot of fellow Christians who said, "You're dumb, you're ignorant. That's why you believe this," and that's not the fruit of the Spirit either, right? That's just a non-starter.
Right, and then to realize when we're conveying that accidentally even is part of the challenge. But there was a January series then more recently with Todd Wood and Daryl Falk, where they actually did a dialogue between young Earth creationists and evolutionary creationists, and they gave their tips on how they figured out how to have a conversation. Their book was titled "The Fool and the Heretic," because either you're foolish to think that or you're heretical to think that, and nobody likes to be called those names. So we should,
It's never worked for me to say, "You're not dumb, you're just wrong."
Yeah, that doesn't work either, does it? Yeah.
I'm wondering how you approach two different things when you see all this. One is you look at the size of the universe, you look at the hundreds and millions of galaxies, and you realize that humanity is so small. How do you approach that in preaching? The second is how do you approach it when people look at this and they see a universe that's so much better at creating black holes than it is life, and they watch Nova specials about the sun expanding to destroy the earth and the heat death of the universe, and they find just meaninglessness in all of this instead of the beauty and glory of God.
So many good things packed into there. Let's see. Let me stay here and remind me of the bits that I don't forget. About the future of the universe, there we have a lot of scriptural basis for talking about what will happen in the future and where we're finding our hope. For me, I bring that together with science, thinking that all of our predictions for the future of the universe is based on assuming that what we understand now is correct and the only thing involved, and that just continues. And even scientifically, we don't have a great basis for that assumption. And spiritually, we think that God can change things up whenever he likes. As far as universe better at creating black holes than at creating life, I've heard people view that both directions. Some people say, well, Earth is the only one. Oh, we are so small and insignificant because we're the only one. And other ones say, Earth's the only one. We're incredibly special because we're the only one. And if there were lots of other ones out there, then we wouldn't be special anymore. So you start to need some better, what's the right way to measure human significance? And it all comes back to how God viewed us, whether or not there's more life out there, whether God made it intelligent life abundant in the universe or very rare. We know God loves us because God came to this planet to be incarnate as one of us and died for us. That's where we have to look for our significance rather than playing a numbers game. As far as the significance and the sheer size, I have one more slide. And I didn't show this at first because this is going to be in the video for the afternoon worship session. Biologos partnered with the Worship Symposium to create the call to worship for the Colossians 1 service. And the other passage where God says, as high as the heavens are above the earth, he goes on not to say my ways are higher than your ways, but to say, so great is God's love. God knows that we're going to feel small in the universe. Even before we knew about billions of galaxies out there, he knew we would feel small. And he said, when you look at that, yeah, you're small, but don't think about that. Think about how vast God's love is. And then it goes on, as far as the east is from the west. So in that flat earth cosmology, that was like one end of their creation to the other. Now you'd think about one end of the universe to the other. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. And God invites us to picture how much he forgives our sins, and to picture our sins removed to the ends of the universe. So the next time you hear all these numbers about how small we are, think about how great God's love is and God's forgiveness is, because that's what Scripture is pointing to.
And that was something Israel praised God for, that God's specialty is noticing the littlest people. And Jesus did it too when he was here.
Yeah.
He saw the invisible people. So yeah, David looks up and says, boy, what are we in the midst of all that? It's like, dude, what you didn't know was a lot. But the theological idea that God specializes in seeing us in our littleness is more important now than ever. But it's still true.
Yeah.
Another question?
Thanks for this. It's been great. I also have black holes in my question here.
Uh-huh.
And when we think of the idea of God's glory being expressed through, through the universe, we can think of it being in terms of just creating it, starting it, sustaining it, continuing it. But we also think of light and color, and the beauty of the pictures make us think like sunsets and sunrises, so the glory is in the color.
Yeah.
So my question is where are the black holes in relation to what's being seen and observed? And how might, along with the color and the light being an expression of God's glory, how might black holes come into that conversation?
Because the black holes feel more destructive, or?
I think, I know very little about it, but they have sort of an insidious, they suck things in to nothingness versus light and color beautifully going out. So how do we hold both of these things in the larger context of God's creative activity?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the biologists will often sort of say that to me at the end of talks, like, nature has some icky stuff too, right? And some dangerous stuff. And there's dangerous stuff in the universe too. Black holes, if you get near one, yes, you will die if you get close enough. And a supernova explosion, if one went off with a nearby star, that would actually damage things here on Earth. So there are dangerous things in space. I don't want to hallmarkize this, and just make it, it's just all pretty. It's a little like the beauty of Mount Everest. Just an incredibly harsh environment and not something you can survive in very easily, but a stark beauty and majesty that shows you there's things greater than yourself. Or the desert in Death Valley having these little bits of life in it, but being an incredibly harsh environment. So God has made those too, and he's not a tame God, and it's not a safe universe, but we have a God who cares for us in the midst of it.
Let me try to see one more real quick, where we've got like a minute, unless you want to just ask your question afterwards. But
So first, thank you so much for everything. I want just first to point out that we talked about the dialogue. I want to share the quote from Joseph Joubert. He's French, and he says that the aim of an argument or discussion is not victory but progress. And that's very, very interesting, just to share that first. My question is about the Magi, because they are the first people that we know in the Bible that they know astronomy and everything. And this star that they saw about, I wished we talked about this star too. I know it's symbolic in a way that it's maybe this light that God first invented, and the father of the church say that this first light that God invented on the first day was the light to build this relationship with the human, but not with his body, but with his soul. So to enter his soul and to speak with him through this light.
Okay.
And that's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah, I'm not sure I followed the last bit, but about the Magi and them doing astronomy, yes?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. I need to put an article about this online so people can hear this answer. Short form. So there's been a lot of explanations for that Star of Bethlehem. Astronomers love thinking about that. Christian astronomers love thinking about this one. Was it a comet? Was it a supernova explosion? Was it a conjunction of planets? It could have been any of those things. I'm also fine with it being an outright miracle, just, magical light in the sky. Just there it is, like the Shekinah glory that led the Israelites through the wilderness. I think theologically what you have is these magi from non-Jewish culture had heard enough about Jewish culture to match up these signs of what they were seeing in the sky with a ruler in Israel. And you know what they did? They went on a long journey, and they came asking questions, and they came bearing gifts, and they wanted to worship. Meanwhile, the leaders in Jerusalem, who may or may not have seen the same astronomical thing, but probably it was open for them to view, well, they didn't even bother going a couple miles down to Bethlehem to check it out. So I think that's maybe one of the lessons we often forget about the Magi. But God's light was coming, and it was for all peoples, not just the Jews.
I mean, astronomically, it shouldn't have worked. Right? You can't follow a star. When I was a kid, when I was a kid, I used to say to my dad, we were riding down the highway, going back from Grandpa and Grandma, I said, "Dad, the moon's following us." Well, no, it isn't.
It's not. It's not. There, right? So that's actually the problem with all of the theories I just rattled off. Like, what does it mean for it to move? It turns out in the Greek, there is a technical scientific term for those phrases of the star rose. It rising in the east, it's actually a technical for how the planets move relative to the sun at a certain time in their year and what constellation that was happening in. And then the star stopped. My understanding is it's the Greek term for when planets are moving through the sky, they sometimes do a little zigzag pattern, and when they're right at the end of that zig, they kind of pause for a bit before coming back. It's for that moment when the planet is paused there. And that would have meant for it to stop. So the star stopped as they were getting close to Bethlehem, and they're like, okay, here we are. So, there's more when you dig into it.
The main thing is God got them there. I mean, it shouldn't have worked, but it did because God brought them there for very, very good reason.
And choose to work through whatever that was in their heads about what these signs in the heavens meant. God chose to work through that, and that's amazing.
That Greek thing, what you said, I mean, the Greeks noticed that there were certain stars that didn't behave right. They wandered. Mm-hmm. And so they called them planetos, wanderers.
Yep.
And that's where we get planet from. Because what they were seeing was Jupiter and Mars and Venus, right? They don't move like the other stars because they're right nearby, turns out. Yep. But that's where we get the word planet. And on that note, we're out of our time. Let's thank Deb for all she brought to us today.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much, Deb. I do encourage you to check out BioLogos and find their website, and there's tons of blogs and articles on there.